Robert Taylor, the dark-haired, soft-spoken heartthrob who could melt audiences with a single glance. Together they graced the same red carpets, starred under the same studio system, and shared the same impossible fame. But behind the scenes, behind the elegant tuxedos and rehearsed smiles, something darker was brewing, a simmering resentment, a silent accusation, and one fateful incident that shattered their brotherhood forever. The world knew Gable as the fearless Rhett Butler. But Robert Taylor knew another side. A moment during World War II would reveal everything. It wasn't a disagreement over roles or women. It wasn't about money. It was about courage, or what Taylor claimed was Gable's lack of it. In the golden age of Hollywood, where MGM reigned supreme and stars weren't born but manufactured under the watchful eye of Louis B. Mayer, two names stood taller than the rest: Clark Gable, with that devil-may-care grin and rugged charm, and Robert Taylor, the studio's more refined, romantic counterpart. They were both MGM darlings, carefully sculpted into icons, yet the bond they appeared to share on the surface was, in truth, built on little more than shared studio contracts and parallel public images. Underneath, they were two men walking very different paths, headed for a collision they could never have predicted. Gable was earthy, masculine, and aloof, a man who thrived on danger and spontaneity. Taylor, on the other hand, was deeply introspective, meticulous, and even a little melancholic. On paper, they should have been rivals, but MGM couldn't afford infighting between its leading men. So the studio cast them in roles that wouldn't overlap. Gable played the rough-edged adventurer, Taylor, the polished gentleman, and the public loved them both. They would see each other often on the lot, exchange pleasantries at studio dinners, and even share drinks at lavish Hollywood parties. But something was always off. Gable never let anyone too close. And Taylor, though polite, never trusted Gable's smirking bravado. They were two different types of men forced to perform the same script, both on and off the screen. Still, they remained cordial. At least until the war came. When World War II broke out, Hollywood's golden men faced a different kind of spotlight, one that didn't involve cameras but combat. Both actors were at an age where enlistment wasn't expected, yet both faced enormous pressure to serve their country, especially as public opinion began to turn on those who stayed behind. And it was in that climate of patriotic fervor, private doubts, and moral reckoning that the seeds of contempt were planted. Robert Taylor didn't hesitate. He joined the U.S. Naval Air Corps in 1942 and was commissioned as a lieutenant. Though MGM was hesitant to lose one of its major stars, Taylor insisted. He wanted to serve, not just in uniform for show, but in active training and propaganda work that genuinely contributed to the war effort. In Taylor's mind, it wasn't just about patriotism. It was about duty, character, and doing what was right, no matter how uncomfortable. Gable, too, eventually joined. But not right away. He hesitated. He had just lost Carol Lombard, his beloved wife, in a tragic plane crash while she was returning from a war bond tour. Devastated and nearly broken by grief, Gable spiraled into isolation. Hollywood sympathized. The public forgave him. But Taylor, quietly and privately, did not. It wasn't just that Gable waited to enlist. It was how he acted when he did. To Taylor, the whole thing felt like a performance, a calculated act to win back the public's favor. When Gable joined the Army Air Forces and was assigned to make a recruitment film, some praised him. But Taylor, hardened by his own time in uniform, wasn't impressed. Behind closed doors, he made a statement that would echo for years. Gable's not a soldier. He's playing one. That was the beginning. The fracture. The wound that would never close. Because the next time they saw each other, the polite mask would fall, and Robert Taylor would call Clark Gable something no one in Hollywood dared to: a coward. War doesn't care about fame. It doesn't pause for autographs or make exceptions for movie stars. When the world was pulled into chaos, even the most carefully curated Hollywood illusions began to crack. Robert Taylor and Clark Gable may have worn uniforms with pride, but how they wore them, and why, became the wedge that drove them apart forever. Robert Taylor's service was quiet, committed, and sincere. Though he didn't see direct combat, he took his military role seriously, training Navy pilots, narrating instructional films, and flying aircraft during training missions. He didn't use the war to elevate his public image. In fact, he grew to resent the celebrity circus surrounding actors in uniform. For Taylor, this wasn't a show. It was about honor, sacrifice, humility. Meanwhile, Clark Gable's war effort was more visible and far more complicated. After Carole Lombard's death, Gable's grief turned to guilt.
People whispered that Lombard had gone on that war bond tour to help his reputation.
That her death was a price paid for his public image. Crushed, Gable finally enlisted in 1942, months after Taylor had already begun his service. But to many, especially Taylor, it felt performative. Gable joined the Army Air Forces as a gunner and officer. His unit, based in England, made training films. And yes, he flew combat missions over Germany. But questions lingered. How many missions? How dangerous were they, really? Was he ever truly in harm's way, or were the cameras always close behind? Taylor had seen too much behind the scenes. He knew how studios manipulated headlines, how generals were pressured by Washington to protect celebrity soldiers, and how some actors used their enlistment as nothing more than a PR strategy. Taylor never accused Gable publicly, but in private he was merciless. He reportedly told a fellow officer, Gable didn't enlist for his country. He enlisted for his image. The bitterness grew when Gable returned from Europe in 1944 and was celebrated as a hero. His face was everywhere, on newsreels, magazine covers, and propaganda films. He was photographed in uniform, smiling with generals, surrounded by adoring troops. The public ate it up, but Taylor watched it all in silence, fuming, and then came the studio reunion. One evening in early 1945, MGM held a private event to welcome back its stars from service. The room was full of applause, cigars, champagne, and false smiles. Gable and Taylor hadn't seen each other in nearly 3 years. When they finally locked eyes, the air thickened. Gable, still grieving, tried to offer a nod, a gesture of mutual respect. But Taylor didn't smile. He didn't raise a glass. Instead, he leaned toward a fellow officer and muttered 6 words that would change everything. The words weren't shouted. They weren't recorded, but they spread, and fast. Within a week, half of MGM's backlot had heard the story. Some dismissed it as jealousy. Others weren't so sure, because behind the polished facades of old Hollywood, everyone knew Gable and Taylor had walked into the same war, but they hadn't come out of it the same men. What Taylor saw, or believed he saw, during those years in uniform, had forever changed how he viewed Clark Gable. Not as a co-star, not even as a rival, but as a man who hid behind the screen even in the face of real danger. And once that line was crossed, there was no turning back. In hushed tones, he called Gable a coward, and once that word left Taylor's mouth, it never came back. The rift was permanent, Hollywood insiders whispered. Studio heads scrambled, and yet the truth, what really happened between these two legends, was buried for decades. Until now, this is the story Clark Gable never wanted you to hear, and the one Robert Taylor died still holding on to. It was just a whisper, a bitter remark tossed out at a party, meant for one set of ears but picked up by many. But in Hollywood, whispers are louder than gunshots, and reputations are built, or broken, on the things said behind closed doors. When Robert Taylor called Clark Gable a coward, he didn't just insult a man. He fired a bullet into the myth of the king of Hollywood, and nothing was ever the same again. At first, the rumor seemed too outrageous to be true. Gable, a coward? The man who had flown missions over Nazi-occupied Europe? Who lost the love of his life to a war bond tour and still managed to enlist in her honor? It couldn't be. Yet the source of the claim gave it weight. This wasn't a bitter extra or jealous screenwriter. This was Robert Taylor, a fellow leading man and a respected military officer. And the industry paid attention. MGM panicked. Studio heads knew that a feud between Gable and Taylor could tear apart their carefully constructed brand of brotherhood. Taylor was clean-cut, reliable. Gable was bold, iconic. But now they were on opposite ends of a moral war. Mayer called them in separately. No cameras, no press, just quiet meetings in private offices. Gable was furious. He denied nothing outright, but he didn't offer apologies either. Taylor refused to back down. He wasn't looking for headlines.
He simply didn't want to stand beside a man he believed had worn the uniform for all the wrong reasons. Word got out, as it always does.
The whispers turned into stories, and those stories began to shape how the industry viewed both men. Gable, once untouchable, now found himself under a microscope. People questioned his motives, re-examined his war record, wondered aloud whether he had been shielded from true danger by higher-ups who couldn't afford to lose a box-office king, and Taylor. He became something else entirely. No longer just a matinee idol, he was seen as a man of principle, someone who had served quietly, never demanded recognition, and wasn't afraid to challenge the system. But even for him, the consequences were real. His once lucrative partnership with Gable never materialized again. The two never acted together, never shared another photograph, and were never seen side by side publicly after that fateful year. Behind the scenes, the tension boiled. On set, other actors chose sides. Some called Taylor self-righteous, even arrogant. Others whispered that he had simply voiced what many had long suspected, that Gable's war service was more image than action. The divide wasn't just personal, it was generational. Taylor represented the soldier actor, duty first, fame second. Gable? He was still the movie star, even in uniform. In a strange twist, both men returned from the war with scars, only theirs weren't visible. Taylor, more withdrawn, struggled to return to the on-screen charm he once radiated so easily. Gable, meanwhile, aged rapidly. His grief, his service, and now the silent condemnation from a former friend had left him shaken. He smiled less, drank more, and in private moments, even he admitted, Carol would have hated what I became. The tragedy was, the years rolled on, and the lights of old Hollywood began to dim. The studio system that had created gods out of men collapsed under the weight of a new era, and with it, the legends of Robert Taylor and Clark Gable slowly drifted into the hazy glow of nostalgia. But one thing never changed, the silence. Not a single interview, not a public acknowledgement, not even a whispered reconciliation. The rift between Taylor and Gable remained untouched, buried under the golden veneer of their studio-crafted images. And yet everyone in the business knew something had broken between them that was never fixed. Gable tried to move on. He remarried, made a few more films, but something inside him had shifted after the war. He was no longer the cocky, grinning king of the silver screen. His eyes carried a heaviness. Those close to him said he seemed haunted, not just by Carole Lombard's death, but by something deeper. Regret, maybe guilt, perhaps even shame. He died in 1960, just days after wrapping The Misfits with Marilyn Monroe. And when his will was made public, it was quiet. Elegant and final. No mention of Taylor. No letters. No olive branch. Just a quiet goodbye. Taylor lived longer, until 1969, but his final years were no less complicated. Diagnosed with lung cancer, he too reflected more than he spoke. He continued to act, but he had withdrawn from the Hollywood spotlight. He rarely discussed Gable, and when he did, it was always in guarded terms. But in private, one confidant revealed something startling after Taylor's death. He never regretted what he said, but he regretted that it had to be said at all. That's the heartbreaking truth buried beneath this tale. Not just the falling out, but the silence that followed. Two men who once stood at the very top of the world, who served under the same flag, who saw war and fame collide in the most personal of ways, never found peace between each other, not because one was right and the other was wrong, but because pride and pain ran too deep. In the years since, biographers and historians have wrestled with the question, was Clark Gable truly a coward? Or was Robert Taylor simply a man who demanded too much from someone already broken? The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the space between legend and reality. Gable did fly missions. Taylor did serve with honor. But both were wounded by a war that neither Hollywood nor history truly understood. Today, their legacies remain intact, immortalized in black and white glory, streaming across screens they never lived to see. But for those who know the deeper story, there's a different kind of lesson buried in their saga. That behind the posters and premieres, the accolades and adoration, these men were still just men, flawed, proud, hurting, and in the end, perhaps the real tragedy wasn't in the accusation itself, but in the silence that followed, a silence that outlived them both, fade to black, and just that two Hollywood giants fell out. It was that they never made peace. Not even once. Not even when time and age could have softened everything. Because in the town built on fiction, this was one story too personal, too raw, and too human to ever be rewritten.